The allegory of the cave, of humanity being chained in darkness, knowing only shadows on the wall, wheeling and dealing, living out their lives in ignorance and corruption, has haunted the minds of the Western world for 2,000 years. One interpretation of the allegory that Plato himself was anxious to have you make is that it is an allegory of education, and that the key to the allegory is that the ascent out of the cave of ignorance and degradation is by education to the truth. But what then is the true knowledge which is only to be found by the ascent from the cave to the light of the sun? Plato offers his theory of the nature of knowledge in the Republic from section 509 to the end of Book 6. Socrates is represented as conversing at this point with Glaucon, one of Plato's brothers, and to illustrate his theory of knowledge, he gives directions for a seemingly simple diagram. Take a line divided into two unequal parts, one to represent the visible order, the other the intelligible, and divide each part again in the same proportion. With these words, Plato introduces his famous figure of the divided line of knowledge, which is his effort to present his theory of knowledge diagrammatically, as the cave presented it allegorically. A vertical line is divided into 4 segments, each of which, from the lowest to the highest, represents a level of knowledge. Each level of knowledge, conjecture, belief, understanding, reason, has its own objects and its own method for knowing them. The basic division, however, is between knowledge, whose objects are in the intelligible world, and opinion, whose objects are in the visible world. And now to examine the divided line and its levels of knowledge in some detail. Conjecture, or imagining, represents the lowest rung on the ladder formed by the divided line of knowledge. Its objects yield the lowest degree of truth. It is the level of knowledge in which mental activity is at a minimum, as in the awareness of shadows, reflections in water, or in mirrors, or in smooth, shiny surfaces, or after images. Other examples of the level of conjecture are optical illusions, dream images, fantasies, soft, borderline appearances at the point of waking or of falling asleep. But Plato's references to shadows and to images and illusions are rich with many implications. Plato is saying many things at once here. He is saying that the awareness of images is the lowest level of knowledge, since images are only shadows of the actual objects known by perception, which is a higher level of knowing than imagining, but is still only opinion, not knowledge. Plato seems to be alluding to artists whose paintings or sculptures are, as Plato sees them, only images, shadows, copies of actual human beings and other real objects. A still life painting of an apple is only an image of the actual apple. Painters, poets, sculptors, playwrights, whether of comedy or tragedy, are for Plato mere makers of images, fabricators of shadows and illusions, purveyors of make-believe, and Plato assigns them and their work to the lowliest level of the divided line of knowledge. Why does Plato so degrade and devalue the artist? Plato is suspicious of all forms of communication which use images, such as painting, poetry, plays, sculpture, since the masses in a democracy are easily influenced and controlled by persuasive imagery. What do you suppose Plato would have thought of television commercials, or of the slick paper magazine ads for sports cars, diamonds, and round-the-world ocean cruises? What would he have thought of our growing public relations industry, which is in the business of manufacturing images for its customers to present to the public. Plato also feared politicians as skillful image makers. He believed that the sophists, for their own political purposes, were teaching their clients a distorted image of the Athenian constitution, and thus they presented only a shadow, a blurred image of the actual constitution. At the present time, a good example of a mere shadow knowledge of our own constitution occurred in the responses to a recent questionnaire in which many people rejected as illegal a set of statements which turned out to be the Bill of Rights of the Constitution of the United States. The next level on the ascent of the divided line of knowledge is that of belief, which is the perception of actual objects. The level of belief is, first of all, the level on which there occurs the recognition of things, of three-dimensional objects, visible things like apples, people, stars, dogs, cities. This is the level of human knowledge at which the classification and organization of perceived objects begins. The actual things recognized are grouped together or classified insofar as they are similar, as apples are classified as Macintosh, Baldwin, Delicious, Rome, Stamen, and so forth. But knowledge at the level of belief does not grasp the abstract concepts of the objects which are perceived, does not grasp the botanist's concept of the apple, which identifies the unchanging characteristics of each species of apple. Belief, which has its source in the perception by the senses of actual objects, is thus insecure. It is not based upon abstract truths or principles which are unchanging, and which would give the farmer what the scientific botanist has: true knowledge on the basis of which he could rationally classify, predict, explain, and systematize what he knows. The point that Plato is trying to make us see is that perception of objects by the senses in the visible world can never give us true knowledge, and for two reasons. First, what can be known by the senses, he tells us, is only the world of flux, the world of Heraclitus, the world of particular things that are in the process of change. What we know at the level of belief is always subject to change, since we know only what we perceive in the visible world, which is the world of continual change. Since the features we perceive trees and horses and people and cities and chairs to have are continually changing, we can never be sure of our knowledge of them. We can only know how things seem to be on the basis of our perception of them, not how they actually are. In fact, says Plato, we do not have knowledge at this level, but only opinion. It is, however, true opinion, since it does recognize actual objects and does provide rough classifications and rough predictions. Plato is saying that this is the level on which the common sense mind, the mind of the man in the street, operates. It is therefore to be distinguished from the level of conjecture, which knows only images and shadows, and which can only be called false opinion. Plato is also trying to give us a second reason that sense perception can never give us true knowledge. This second reason is that knowledge derived from the senses can never give us general, universal, unchanging, and abstract truths of the intelligible world. Rather, the senses can give us only particular, changing, and concrete observations of this house, that dog, that tree of the visible world. Plato is thus maintaining that sense perception, which is how we know on the level of belief, cannot give us certainty in knowledge or unchanging universal truths about reality. But certainty and universal truth about reality are precisely what true knowledge must provide. What then is true knowledge? And how can true knowledge be reached? The pressure of these questions is now intensifying for Socrates' friends, Glaucon and Adeimantus, as Plato describes the mounting tension of the ladder of knowledge. And we too feel this tension as we climb the ladder and look back at the world of everyday beliefs based on unexamined common sense experience of how things seem. Even farther down below us now is the world of mere images, shadows and fantasies, the world of powerful but deceptive illusions fabricated by artists, poets, dramatists, myth makers, and political demagogues, con men, like the notorious sophists as Plato saw them. With Plato, we reject these lower levels of thinking and what they think about. And we reject the kind of life that is lived by human beings on these low levels of knowledge. And so we ascend to the third level of the ladder of knowledge, the level of rational understanding or intellect. The change is from belief in the concrete, changing, particular objects of perception to the rational understanding of abstract, unchanging, universal concepts, which are the objects known by intellect. Whereas the traditional farmer, on the level of belief, makes a rough classification of particular apples by perceiving their actual different shapes, sizes, colors, and textures, the scientific botanist has knowledge of the precise characteristics of each species of apple. Also, he has knowledge of the principles of morphology concerning the reproductive parts of the apple blossom, and he has knowledge of the principles of genetics concerning the genes of the different species of apples, and he has knowledge also of techniques for the improvement of the apple species. The change from the knowledge of the traditional unscientific farmer to the scientific botanist, this is the change we have brought about by ascending from belief to rational understanding. And in making this ascent to the third level of the ladder of knowledge, we have come now to grasp the significance of the divided line. For on the third level, on which we have now arrived, we have crossed over the major division of the divided line of knowledge. We have entered the intelligible world. We have left the cave of everyday beliefs and artistic fantasies, and we have struggled upward into the light of the sun. We have left behind the concrete objects of the visible world, the everyday objects of the prisoners in the cave. But what kind of objects are we ascending to in the light of the sun? What objects do we know by intellect when we cross over the line into the intelligible world? Plato's answer is that the objects which we know by intellect or rational understanding on the third level of knowledge are the true concepts to which we have already made reference in contrast to the objects of belief. We have already noted that whereas the objects of perception are concrete, the objects of intellect are abstract. Whereas the objects of perception are particular things, the objects of intellect are general or universal concepts. And whereas the objects of perception are changeable, in process, in Heraclitean flux, the objects of intellect are unchanging, in Parmenidean eternal immutability. Plato has a special name for such concepts. He calls them forms or ideas. But how do such concepts give us true knowledge? What is their relation to the concrete objects of perception? How many such concepts are there? How can we know them? How can we prove that they are eternally true? In asking these questions, we have come face to face with Plato's famous theory of ideas, his famous theory of forms, which is his most creative and influential philosophical contribution. and is the central theme of his entire philosophy. Since we've crossed over into the intelligible world, whose objects are the forms, let us pause now before ascending to the highest levels of the divided line and examine the Platonic theory of forms. For Plato, concepts such as the concept of a circle, a triangle, beauty, justice, as well as the concepts that make up our everyday vocabulary, such as house, yellow, man, have two crucial functions. The first of these functions is that they make it possible for us to know the actual world of things, as well as the objects of mathematics and the sciences and philosophy. Their second function is that they enable us to evaluate and to criticize all these objects. First, how do abstract concepts enable us to have knowledge of all objects, the objects both of the visible world and of the intelligible world? Plato's point is that to think or to communicate at all requires the use of concepts. Concepts are the means by which the universe is made intelligible. The simplest statement, "There is a man," uses the concept man. "There is an apple," uses the concept apple. For anything that can be named, horse, triangle, man, justice, there is a concept, and to each concept there corresponds its eternal form. And now we can define an idea or form for Plato. Forms are the objective, universal, and immutable set of qualities which define concepts. More simply put, forms define our concepts. Forms or ideas are the eternal and immutable definitions of our concepts. For example, the form of the concept triangle is that it is a plane figure bounded by three intersecting lines with three internal angles whose sum is 180 degrees. This form is shared by the entire class of triangles, that is, by all the triangles that ever have been or will be drawn. Forms or ideas are the eternal and immutable, absolutely true definitions of our concepts, such as man, beauty, triangle. Forms specify the qualities which any particular man, any particular beautiful object, or any particular triangle must have in order to be considered a man, or beautiful, or a triangle. But also, the forms are real. They are independently existing entities. They have independent reality in the realm of the intelligible. As for particular things, such as men or triangles, they are real only to the extent that they measure up to the eternal truth of the form. Plato sometimes speaks of the forms as essences, meaning that they constitute the essence or essential substance of things. We can now understand that the forms or ideas are not mere ideas for Plato. They are not subjective. They are not merely mental entities confined to human minds. By idea, we ordinarily mean any particular thing we think of, something in my consciousness, something private to my mind. Just the contrary of this, the forms are no mere ideas or mental entities for Plato. Of all the components that make up reality, the forms have the greatest claim to reality, are the most real for Plato. They are the essential substance of any reality, of whatever is real enough to be thought about. The changing things of the visible world relate to the immutable forms of the intelligible world as imperfect copies of the forms. We can see now how it is that the forms make true knowledge possible. As we have already discovered, true knowledge must meet two requirements. It must be immutable, unchanging, and unchangeable, and it must be about what is real. Knowledge based upon sense perception, at the level of belief, was, we found out, neither unchanging because of its insecurity, nor about the real, since it was knowledge about the flux. By contrast, knowledge based upon the forms will be immutable and unchanging, since the forms are immutable. And knowledge based upon the forms will be knowledge of the real, since the forms constitute essential reality. And now briefly to examine the second function of the forms, that is, their evaluative and critical function. The pure and eternal forms define our concepts. By the same token, they establish standards or ideals by which to evaluate the world of things and flux. In the world of flux, things are always in a state of change. They are coming into existence or passing away. And the qualities of the forms, for example, the case of the apple, are very imperfectly copied in the concrete worm-holed apple. Similarly, no actual lines that we can draw will meet the standard of the form equality. No two lines in the visible world are ever perfectly equal. Nothing in the visible world is ever perfect in its kind. Only the pure, intelligible, immutable forms, which establish the qualities defining each specific concept, whiteness, justice, circle, triangle, only the pure forms are perfect. As we shall see, Plato will make his most striking use of the evaluative or normative function of the forms with regard to the ethical and political forms of goodness and justice. Whereas to most of us, as to the sophists, justice is relative. On Plato's theory of forms, the form of justice is, like all other forms, immutable and eternal. Would a present-day socialist or communist accept this? And now to return to the ladder of knowledge. The third level of knowledge is, as we have already seen, the level of rational understanding or intellect. Plato was here describing the kind of knowledge which characterizes mathematics and the sciences. The objects of the mathematician's knowledge are forms, forms such as triangles, circles, and other mathematical objects. These forms are known by the mathematician's rational understanding or intellect, and they are objective, universal, and immutable. These forms are unchanging and eternal. The area of a circle is always pi r squared. But the mathematician's knowledge does have deficiencies. It is still tied to the visible world by its use of diagrams in the proofs of geometry, the well-known figures of squares, triangles, circles. A second limitation of knowledge at this level is that it does not examine or prove its own assumptions, and thus this knowledge remains hypothetical or conditioned rather than being based upon first principles which are proven to be true. Natural sciences, like mathematics, have as their objects the forms with which these sciences deal. For example, Plato thought, the forms of earth, air, fire, water. And although the natural sciences, like mathematics, provide knowledge of the forms, both mathematics and the sciences are limited in three respects. They rest upon unexamined first principles, they are tied to examples, particulars, instances from the visible world, and they are piecemeal, fragmentary. They fail to show the relations of the sciences to one another. We ascend now to the fourth and highest level of knowledge, pure reason. On this level, the mind uses the method of dialectic, which in this context means the science which studies the forms. Dialectic has been called the crowning science of all sciences. Here the true philosopher has come into his own realm. He moves toward knowledge of the forms by the activity of his reason, and through the use of dialectic as his method, the method of analyzing the essences or forms of all things in the universe, and seeing their relationship to one another. And in the dialogue called the Symposium, Plato shows that the philosopher moves toward the eternal and pure forms out of the power of his love, desire, eros, which leads him from the love of a beautiful body to the love of all beautiful things, and then to the love of the beauty of the mind as greater than the beauty of the body. And drawing toward and contemplating the vast sea of beauty, Plato says, at last the vision is revealed to him of a single science, which is the science of beauty everywhere. So in the Republic, the philosopher uses dialectic to take up the unfinished task of the third level of knowledge, and establishes on the fourth level true first principles for mathematics and for the sciences, without employing diagrams or particular things from the visible world. Secondly, dialectic unifies the isolated, fragmentary, unrelated sciences and mathematics into a single systematic unity. And thirdly, dialectic identifies the entire range and variety of forms, from forms of lowly things such as apples and dogs, relations such as equality and similarity, artifacts, man-made things such as beds and chairs, values such as beauty and goodness and justice. By the power of dialectic, the philosopher not only identifies all these forms and establishes their truth, but dialectic also organizes all the forms into a single, rational, structured order of truth and value. The forms constitute a hierarchical structure, a pyramid, from the many least universal to the few most universal, from the most concrete to the most abstract, from the forms of mud and dirt to the forms of identity and difference. And finally, in the ascent to the truth, the philosopher, by the power of love of the good, transcends this rational pyramid, this ordered structure of the hierarchy of forms, and reaches the idea of the good. Plato compares the idea of the good to the sun, whose light makes the concrete things of the world visible, and so is the source of their life and growth and value. In the idea of the good, Plato has given expression to a vision of an absolute source of truth and goodness. The idea of the good is the source of the truth and value of all the other ideas or forms. The idea of the good is the source of the world's moral purpose. With the ascent to the idea of the good, an absolute one of truth and goodness, Plato prepared the way for the Christian God. Like the God of Christianity, the idea of the good is the supreme value. It is the source of all value. The idea of the good is Plato's conception of the absolute, the perfect principle of all reality and of all value and of all truth. For 1,000 years, when Christians thought of God, they envisaged the ascent through the power of reason and the power of love to Plato's idea of the good.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.